We're glad to see you all tonight. Thanks for being here on this Wednesday night as we meet together for a period of Bible study. It's always an encouragement. We thank you for being here to be a part of it. We are studying on these Wednesday night classes several lessons about, and we're just calling it the church that Jesus built, and we're looking at the church from a number of different perspectives. We've talked about the universal church, the local church, the difference between the two. We spent a good bit of time talking about Bible authority, which is so critical to the church and how the church is to exist and function. We've been talking in the last couple of weeks about how the church is to be organized. So in all of this is not up to our discretion. It's not our opinion. It's not our think so. It's what is described in the Word of God. Now, men have perverted and changed and innovated all over the place, but we still, when we go back to our New Testaments, we read about the church that Jesus built, the church that was the one that Jesus promised, and he came and built the one church, Matthew 16, verse 18. And we know a lot about it, and therefore we know what the church ought to be like today. If we make the church today just like the church that we read about in the New Testament, we know that's right and can't possibly be wrong. I wonder if I was just appreciated Eric's prayer a minute ago when he thanked the Lord for the church. Do you do that? Do you express gratitude for the fact that we have the church and that it exists for our spiritual well-being, and that God in his great wisdom designed and built the church so that it would function to our spiritual benefit? That's something that we need to be grateful for, and I wonder if we ever really stop to consider that. The church is a great blessing to us, an absolute essential thing to us spiritually, and we need to be grateful. All right, so in the last week or so, we've gotten to the part of our study where we have been describing the organization of the church. We're not going to redo all of that, but we talked about the fact that elders oversee local congregations, and we really tried to emphasize, and it's so very important, that the authority of elders exists only in the local congregation of which they are a part. They have no authority to do anything beyond the bounds of the local congregation of which they are a part. And that's something I want you to really keep in mind, because we're going to see more about that and talk more about that when we talk about the work of the church and how it's supposed to be done. But a very, very important consideration is that elders oversee local churches, but that's the extent of it. That their authority does not go beyond the local church wherein they are members. And this goes back to the very first part of our study. Local churches are organized, but there is no so when the church is described in the local sense, there's an organization to it. Elders, deacons, members. But the universal church has no earthly organization. Jesus, sitting at the right hand of God, is our head, and we are all members of the body, but there's no earthly organization of the universal church. And that's a really important consideration. And any scheme that attempts to mobilize the universal church, any scheme that tries to put the universal church into a working function, can't be right, can't be scriptural. The only organized working unit of the church is the local congregation. Elders oversee the local church. Deacons are specially appointed servants of the church. Remember, we talked last week about the fact that the word deacon just means servant. And all of us ought to be servants. But there is what is described in 1 Timothy 3, the office of a deacon. And so they are specially appointed servants of local congregations, deacons. And then, of course, they are members of the congregation itself. Elders, deacons, members. That's the full description of the organization of a local congregation. Now, toward the end of our study last week, we talked about some changes that began to creep in concerning how local churches were organized. And we read some quotes last week. Again, we're not going to go over all that. We read some quotes last week that pretty early on, not long after the death of the last apostles, there began to be a falling away. There began to be departure from the description of the organization of local churches, wherein maybe one elder began to take a prominent position over the others. And he began to be known as the bishop. Now remember last week we said bishop and elder are interchangeable, synonymous terms. But you had one bishop over, maybe he had taken on himself more authority than the other elders. And then maybe that eldership and that bishop in particular began to oversee maybe several congregations in their general geographical area. And so there began to be a hierarchy, a structure of organization that began to evolve. And that began in the 2nd century. We read indications that this began even within the 2nd century, where some elders began to take more upon themselves and to distinguish themselves above others. And so you saw local area organizations, and then region-wide organization, and then ultimately all the way to a universal or worldwide organization. And we see the Catholic Church as the full culmination of that kind of building structure of organization, way beyond, way above the local congregational level. And so those were some of those changes that took place and have been pursued for centuries ever since. And most, not all, but most religious organizations of our day, most denominations, have a hierarchy of organization that's not described in the pages of the New Testament. And so those changes began a long time ago, and they continue even to the modern day. And again, we're going to get into more of this, and we're going to describe it in more specific terminology when we talk about the work of the church. But even among our own brethren, even among some churches of Christ, this basic organizational structure of local congregations has been violated. And some elders have taken upon themselves to oversee work bigger than the work of the local congregation where they are members. And I'll just drop this terminology out there, and we'll talk more about it as we get to it. But you hear sometimes of the sponsoring church arrangement. And the sponsoring church arrangement is where the elders of one local congregation solicit other congregations to give money to them so that they can oversee a bigger work than their own local congregation would be able to achieve. That's a modern day change in the organizational structure of the church. And so there's just been all kinds of changes, but we go back to what was the basic. What was it? How was it in the first century? What did the Lord intend, and what do we read about in the pages of our New Testament? Now, when people decide that they're going to change that, when they're going to innovate or alter that very simple local church autonomous relationship. In other words, each church is independent and self-governing. There's no higher organization of the Lord's church than at the local church level. But when men go about to change that, I think it's representative, first of all, of a kind of attitude that is wrong. There's just no doubt when we read in the pages of our New Testament that the church was just organized at the local level. Nothing, there's nothing. I mean, you read the New Testament through, and there's not a hint that the church was ever had any organization beyond the local church level. But all through the centuries, and we still see it today, men have said, I think that we could probably be more efficient if we sort of organized it a different way. And so men have not been content to stay with what the Lord authorized. And this goes back, and even some well-known people got wrapped up in this kind of thinking. We hear about Alexander Campbell. A lot of people accuse us wrongly of being followers of Alexander Campbell. Alexander Campbell was in error on this. Alexander Campbell was the first president of the American Christian Missionary Society. And the idea of that was, we need some different organization. In other words, we got a lot of evangelistic work to do all over the world. And we're not going to be able to get the job done unless we build an organization in order to accomplish this. And so we'll get local congregations to send money to a missionary society, for instance, like Alexander Campbell was president of. And then this human organization, this man-made organization, this missionary society, churches will send money to that organization, and then that organization will decide who to send, what preachers to send, and how much money to send to them. And this will be a more efficient way to do the job than what we read about in the pages of our New Testament. What would you say to that suggestion? Roger?
Us sending money direct to the preacher. How much more efficient do you get?
Yeah.
If you got another organization, that's going to cost money to run that organization, plus sending money to the preacher.
So you're putting a middleman in there, and that's not efficient, right?
No.
So Roger suggests it's really a flawed argument to be more efficient. What else? Anybody else? You know, in Colossians 1:23, it says the gospel was preached to all the known world of that day in the first century. And in the first century, they didn't have any hierarchy of organization. And they didn't even have the means and methods that are available to us. And yet they got the gospel out to the whole world. I think it's kind of a flawed argument to suggest you can come up with something better than that. But it also reflects an attitude that I know better than God. And that's a scary thing. JD?
That's what I think a lot of times, the arrangements that people try to come up with leave out the fact that in sort of an unofficial way, congregations can kind of work together in the sense of, there's a preacher who's looking for support to go do, a good work in Africa, let's say, and the church here, can support them so much money, but they need more. But, people in other congregations or the elders may know the elders over there and say, hey, if you all want to, this man's trying to get some, money up. We know him. He's good.
Send us the money, we'll send it to him.
Well, no, but
okay.
I'm saying that you could say, here's this man, Bob. He's going to be going. Simply like, we recommend him to you if you should decide to support him. I'm just trying to say that multiple congregations can support the same preacher, but they're sending that money directly
without building
to
an organization to do it.
Correct.
Yeah,
just word of mouth,
Exactly right.
So I don't think the Bible precludes people from working together. In other words, passing along information and
That's
supporting
right.
the same preacher. But
Yeah. And so that's a sort of scriptural cooperation that exists without building an organization that God never authorized, right? Paul?
I think you also kind of relieve yourself of any responsibility of following up with that individual. In other words, you're just giving it to the organization to ensure that they're remaining scriptural.
I don't want to get my hands dirty.
Yeah.
I want to be able to pat myself on the back and say, look what I did, but I don't really want to get involved.
So
I think you're right.
I think it's really important if you are supporting the missionary that you're more hands-on involved.
I think that's a good
Daily
point.
activities.
I think that's a good point. Anybody else? Again, I'm very hesitant to suggest that I could come up with a plan better than God. That's a scary proposition. Tim?
The idea of efficiency is really the argument the end justifies the means.
Yeah.
Even if it is more efficient, there's the justification for the means of getting there.
Yeah. And that's right. But a lot of people use that kind of reasoning. The end just, look how much good we're doing. It's a good work. How could it possibly be wrong? And they do, as you suggested, they argue it from the end. In other words, the end is what we imagine is good. Therefore, the way of getting, however you get there is okay as long as the end result is good. And that's just flawed reasoning. Wade?
I think sometimes, too, and you can get some negative from, as far as like if one church started trying to get other churches to send them money, then, and it may turn out being innocent as far as the way they feel about it, not as far as scripturality, but eventually they may start becoming a mother church to all these other churches, and so they start developing a hierarchy, and that might have been actually how the ancients.
That's what they did. I think you're exactly right. But I think you're right. I think Tim is right. that people just have, and it's a good, sincere feeling. We want to do good. And we get overwhelmed with the idea of we want to do good, and then we throw authority out the window because we are so determined that this is a good thing that we want to accomplish. It's only good if God says it's good, right? Remember that God is the one who gets to determine what's good and what's not. And it's not up to us to say, well, the end result is good, therefore however we get to that end result is okay. That's flawed reasoning for sure. Tom?
The other bad aspect of it is once you start going astray, it's harder to correct it when you're on the contributing side to it than, actually spreading it yourself.
I think you're right.
If you've got a good eldership, they can stop the false teaching right away by not supporting a guy that is there. Where if you're in this hierarchy, you're this congregation up here that believes it's wrong, well, you stop contributing to it, but you have to stop the false teaching and all that.
Yeah, I think you're right. Once you open that door, it's really true, and that's why we spent several weeks talking about Bible authority and how to establish and apply Bible authority. Because once you do the first thing without Bible authority, then there's really not any stopping place, because you've opened that door, and now you don't have a leg to stand on. You can't really object to other things that are done without authority because you already agreed to the first thing that was done without authority. So it's really a dangerous proposition. So I think it reflects an attitude. I think it suggests a change of purpose, especially we were talking about maybe the elders of one congregation or a particular elder, a bishop over other congregations. I think it changes the purpose. Elders were to be overseers, but once they began to build this hierarchy of organization, they're not really overseers, they're not really shepherds or pastors anymore, they're administrators. And that was never the purpose of elders. Elders' job was not to be administrators, but be pastors or shepherds over the flock. I think when these innovations take place, they upset what we might refer to, and this is just our terminology, a balance of power. So when one group of men let's say, this is not a far-fetched example at all. Let's say that the church here, what we really want to do is that we want to put a TV program on one of the Nashville stations. But that's an expensive thing. And we can't do it. We just don't have the resources to be able to do that. But if we could get other churches to send us money, and then we use that money to put the program on the Nashville television stations, then what's happened is prior to that happening, all elders were at an equal level. Each of them was overseeing their own work of their own congregations. But now this congregation has become, or at least the elders of this congregation have become super elders, because they're overseeing something bigger than the work of their own local congregation. Now the balance of power is destroyed. Now churches are not existing at a same level, and elderships are not working at the same level of organizational structure. And so that sort of balance of power has been destroyed. And then I think one of the big problems with these innovations is that it facilitates the spread of error. If we've got local congregations, independent, self-governing, or autonomous, so what happens if we get off here at College View? We take off on some rabbit chase, and we really get all messed up doctrinally. We are teaching and practicing doctrinal error. It's a bad thing. That's a very bad thing. But if we're a local, independent, autonomous congregation, that error is somewhat confined to this congregation. Hopefully it can be cleared up, but at least there's a firewall around us, because we don't have any input to other congregations. We are just here. We are on our own. If we get off, that's serious, but at least we're not infecting a bunch of other churches with the error that we have imbibed. But if we are organized in some fashion at a level higher than the local congregation, then when that hierarchy begins to take on error or corruption, they already did by way of their organization, but error begins to have channels to infect lots of various congregations and members. And so when churches organize at a level higher than the local church, it facilitates the spread of error. Do you see that point? All right, any other thoughts or comments here? So it's really important for us to understand and be fully committed to the organization of the church. And then that falls back on our previous study about Bible authority. We must have Bible authority for the organization of the local congregation. So it's really important. All right, if we have covered that satisfactorily, and I hope that we have, the next perspective that we want to look at is the worship in the church that Jesus built. The nature of New Testament worship is what we want to investigate for just a little while. We understand that there are kinds of worship that are completely not acceptable to God. In Matthew chapter 15, 7 through 9, Jesus is speaking here, and he said, "Ye hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying, This people draweth nigh to me with their mouth, and honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain they do worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men." We often emphasize this phrase right here. In vain they do worship me. We've described and explained so many times that just simply means worthless, good for nothing. So they're worshiping, but their worship is good for nothing. So it's really important for us to understand the kind of worship that God has authorized in the Lord's church, because if we're not careful, we could fall into this category of worthless worship, our worship to be in vain. In Acts chapter 17, when Paul was in the city of Athens and he was among the various idols and the temples to various idols all around the city of Athens, which was completely given over to idol worship. Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill and said, "Ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you're too superstitious. For as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God, whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, him declare I unto you." And so here Paul said there's such a thing as ignorant worship. Vain worship, ignorant worship. And then I'll give you one more description of flawed worship. In Colossians 2, beginning verse 20, Paul says, if with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations? Then he mentions some of them. Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, referring to things that all perish as they are used, according to human precepts and teachings. These have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, but they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. Self-made religion, including worship that we invent on our own, self-imposed worship, one version refers to. So that's why it's important for us to go back to the New Testament to investigate the subject of worship in the church that Jesus built. Because it's not up to us. It's not up to us to invent worship like we like it or as we would prefer it. It's not up to us to worship like other men in other places or past times have ordained. We got to go back to the Bible and find the worship that is described and authorized in the pages of the New Testament. Because without that, it could be vain, worthless, good for nothing. It could be ignorant and self-made. And we don't want to be guilty of that. We want to engage in the true, acceptable worship that the Lord has ordained. So, one of the principles that we set forth regularly is that New Testament worship is to be in spirit and truth. And my guess is that you know immediately the passage we're going to refer to there is John chapter 4, verse 24. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. Now, there's some different ways to look at those expressions, but the way that we have typically looked at them is to suggest that we have to be sincere and genuine, heartfelt in our worship. No, it's possible to just go through the motions, have no heartfelt devotion at all, just hitting our marks, doing everything, but not really having our heart involved in it at all. That would be wrong. If it's not, if we're not worshiping in spirit, it's wrong. But then the other part of that is if we're not worshiping in truth, as described by the Word of God, then that's wrong as well. And so it's really important for us to worship in spirit and in truth. John 4, verse 24 says. Now, that being the underlying principle that we want to pursue then, we know that worship has specific designs to it. The first and most important design of worship is that it is supposed to glorify God in heaven. I think this is a really important consideration because, especially in our day and time, worship has come to be what men like. And we'll change it if men want something different, if they prefer something uniquely different from what past generations have liked, then we'll do that because we're doing it to please men and draw men to get large numbers. And that's why you see, and on the internet, it's just full of videos of religious worship services that are all geared to the worshiper. You know, what motivates him? What makes him feel emotionally stirred? You know, and so you see big facilities, huge crowds of people assembled, and there's a band on the stage, and I'll tell you, they're really pretty good. I mean, those guys can really perform. It's a performance, and they're very good performers. And the strobe lights are flashing, and the fog machines are spitting out the fog, and it has all the appearance of a rock concert, and a pretty good one at that. Why is that? What are we after there? Who are we trying to serve with that? Well, and we're going to talk here in a minute about the aspect, the various elements of New Testament worship. But you have to think that when you get into those kinds of changes and innovations, it's being done for the worshiper rather than the one who is being worshipped, right? We've talked lots of times about the examples that we've seen, you know, and there's a church in Nashville that has indoor bull riding in their worship services. I like to watch a little bull riding now and again, you know. At the rodeo, it's kind of cool. Can't believe those guys would ever do that, but they choose to do that. But why would we have bull riding in a worship service? Well, because it appeals to man, right? It's to motivate man. It's to please him. And then the one, and you've heard us refer to this numerous times, but there's that church in Nashville that on the 4th of July has indoor fireworks. I can't believe the fire marshal even allows that, but he does, and they shoot off fireworks. Why? Well, because men like fireworks. I like fireworks. Don't you like fireworks? You know, we go to the park on the 4th of July to see the fireworks. Why would we have fireworks in a worship service? For God? No, for man. And so it's really important for us to understand that the worship that God designed in the church, the worship that the church that Jesus built is supposed to engage, is worship that's primarily intended for the purpose of glorifying God. Look in Revelation chapter 4. I've always been impressed here in Revelation chapter 4. You get the picture of the throne, around the throne of God in heaven. And you just get a kind of a glimpse of that. Notice Revelation chapter 4, verse 9. When those beasts give glory and honor and thanks to him that sat on the throne, who liveth forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him that sat on the throne and worship him that liveth forever and ever, and cast their crowns before the throne, saying, Thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are and were created. Thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor. Now that's the concept that we're trying to press here. Our intention should be not to satisfy or please ourselves or other men. Our purpose should be to glorify the Father in heaven. And we need to have a view of that. We need to sense sort of the awe that we would experience if we could picture ourselves in God's throne room, before his very throne as we worship him. This is not about us. This is about him. This is our first and primary objective. And we should never lose sight of that when it comes to worship. We should worship with the intention of glorifying God. And we think clearly that we do that when we worship the way he said to worship. We would not be glorifying him if we said, well, we're going to change some things because we like it better. How would that be glorifying God, who spelled out the worship of the New Testament church? How would we be glorifying him if we changed what he said to do and did it a different way than he said to do it? It wouldn't be so, would it? We think also that worship is intended to build up or edify those who participate. I think it's important, though, that we keep these in proper order. First, glorify God. Secondly, there is an element of worship that is for the purpose of edifying or building up the worshipers. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14, we remember that the church at Corinth had lots and lots of issues. Big trouble at Corinth. And that first letter, Paul really goes through a laundry list of issues that existed in Corinth. And he has to rebuke them and set them right. There were some abuses that existed in their elements of worship, described here in 1 Corinthians 14, verse 26. He said, How is it then, brethren, when you come together, every one of you hath a psalm, hath a doctrine, hath a tongue, hath a revelation, hath an interpretation? Let all things be done unto edifying. And so there was, and we'll talk a little bit more about this text as we go on, but there was just confusion reigning when the church at Corinth came together, and everyone was going about doing their own thing. And Paul's rebuking them for the chaos that existed in their assemblies. And he said the principle that needed to be observed was, let all things be done unto edifying. In that text, he mentioned, for instance, tongue speaking. Well, they were speaking in tongues simultaneously. There was no interpreter to tell what the tongue speaking even meant. And so he says, the guy speaking tongues may be encouraged by that, but those who hear him are not getting anything out of it because there's no interpretation. So what he's saying here in this text is, when you worship together, the outcome of it needs to be that people are edified by the experience. Now, let me ask you, we were just saying indoor bull riding, indoor fireworks, performance worship, a rock band with strobe lights and fog machines. What if someone said, that really appeals to me. I get excited. When I see that sort of thing. Could we justify it if we just took a general survey of people? What would make you feel better? What would make you feel more motivated or stimulated? What kind of changes could we do to our worship that would make you feel better when you left and feel like you had gotten more out of it when you left? Would that be justified kind of thinking? In other words, it should edify. I'll tell you, bull riding edifies me. I don't know about you, but man, when I watch a guy riding a bull, boy, that excites me. Would that be justification? Wade?
We usually introduce songs every year to this congregation. And I think one of the things that we look at when we introduce a song to this congregation, first of all, we want to make sure the song is scriptural. And we want to make sure the song is edifying. I mean, there's thousands and thousands of songs out there. But just because a song has a good musical tune doesn't mean that it's a good song to sing. Doesn't mean it's a very edifying song, and it makes you think, and it makes you worship good. So, I think we try to do a good job with singing those songs in this congregation.
All right. I think the principle that you're suggesting there is it has to first be authorized, and then it has to edify, right? And so if a song, man, it's a really upbeat song. Oh, man, I get really excited singing this song. But it's full of unscriptural content. Then it's failed the first test, therefore the second one doesn't met. The test of edification can't be met because it already failed the test of biblical soundness, right? And that is exactly what we're talking about here. We can't justify something just because it edifies if it's not biblically sound, okay? Everybody, we good on that point? All right, so there's a design to worship, glorify God, edify or build up those who worship. Now, there's an overarching principle of, and you know this expression, decently and in order, and that comes from 1 Corinthians 14 also. There was so much commotion and chaos and confusion in the worship of the church at Corinth, and Paul was rebuking that 14th chapter in particular. He goes into specific detail about their singing and their praying and their teaching and preaching, and he has to correct them for the chaos that was existing. And he used this expression, let all things be done decently and in order. The word decent means literally in a seemly manner, fitting to the occasion. In order suggests a fixed arrangement, not spontaneous. Okay? So if we're going to worship decently in order, then it has to be fitting to the occasion, and it is not to be spontaneous, but rather to be after a fixed arrangement. Okay? So this is really an important criteria that must be met by worshipers worshiping. It be done decently and in order. I don't want to wear out the illustration, but I'll tell you, indoor fireworks and bull riding are not decent and orderly. It fails that test almost beyond imagination. It fails that test. It's not decent. It's not orderly. And so New Testament worship, the worship of the church that Jesus built, must meet that test. It must be done in a manner fitting to the occasion and in a fixed arrangement, decently and in order. Any thoughts or comments here? Everybody? All right, we're just almost out of time, but I want to introduce the next part of this. Again, we're talking about worship in the church. And so I want to spend just a little time talking about the elements, or sometimes we refer to them as the 5 acts of New Testament worship. Because there's authority here. There's authority for what we do in worship. We are not left up to our own imaginations. It wasn't God said, worship me. Oh yeah, okay. Okay, what do I do? What do I do next? And then we had to dream up our own conclusion about how we're going to worship God. Because He said worship Him, but He didn't give us any details how to worship. That's not the case, is it? God wants us to worship Him, and we have authority. We have information about that worship. So, in the church that Jesus built, and we read about in the pages of the New Testament, one of the things that they did was to observe the Lord's Supper. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, this is a text that the men, when they up here on Sunday very often, they read from 1 Corinthians 11 about the Lord's Supper. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11, beginning verse 20, again, here's one of the abuses that existed in the church at Corinth. When you come together, therefore, into one place, he said, this is not to eat the Lord's Supper. Now, understand that phrase. He's rebuking them here, and he's saying, it ought to be that when you come together to eat the Lord's Supper. But in their case, they had violated that, and it was not so. So he said, to their shame, when you come together, this is not to eat the Lord's Supper, for in eating everyone taketh before other his own supper, one is hungry and another is drunken. So he's rebuking them, right? And then he goes on to tell them how it ought to be done. He says, for I have received the Lord that which I also delivered unto you, that the Lord the same night in which he was betrayed took bread, and when he had given thanks, he brake it, and said, take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me. After the same manner also he took the cup, when he had supped, saying, this cup is the New Testament of my blood. This do ye as oft as ye drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as ye eat this bread and drink this cup, you do show the Lord's death till he come. And so he rebuked them for their violations of the practice of the Lord's Supper. And then he told them what they ought to do and how it was supposed to be done. In regards to the Lord's Supper, what I'd like to point out as we go through this is, in every one of these 5 acts of New Testament worship, men have changed it. Men have altered and perverted all 5 acts of New Testament worship. What would be, let me ask you, what would be the way in which they have perverted the Lord's Supper? Anybody? What would be an example of a modern day perversion of the Lord's Supper, Roger?
How often they do it.
How often they do it, and what day they do it on. You know, various religious groups will observe a Lord's Supper any given day of the week, but they might only do it 2 or 3 times a year, right? JD?
Also.
Yeah, exactly right. We already talked about this. Remember when we were talking about authority, we spent a little while looking at Acts 20, verse 7. Here's a case of approved apostolic example. Remember when we were talking about authority and establishing authority? This was approved apostolic example. This was the church at Troas. The inspired apostle Paul was there. He was a participant in this action. So this is an approved apostolic example. Upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached to them, ready to depart on the morrow, continued his speech till midnight. So here's our authority for the first day of the week, but men have not held to that. They've not limited themselves. They might take the Lord's Supper on any given day of the week, and then, as Roger said, they don't take it every first day of the week. We talked about that this passage also is an example of necessary inference. Since there's no specific first day of the week mentioned, we are left to the conclusion, the inescapable conclusion, the forced conclusion, the necessary inference that this was something they did every first day of the week. Most religious groups have changed that entirely. They may do it on various days of the week, but most all of them fail to do it every first day of the week. And so they have perverted this act of worship. We're just out of time. Let me ask you a question. What's your thinking? The Lord's Supper is the most important act of worship. What do you think about that statement? Which one is most? So, Gordon, I think correctly said, it's an important act of worship. But all acts of worship are important, right? And so it's really not possible to say this one act of worship is the most important one. They're all important. What if we had a Sunday when we met to worship and we observed the Lord's Supper, but we didn't have any singing? We didn't take up a contribution. How would you feel about that? Well, it wouldn't be right. It wouldn't be scriptural worship, right? Because we haven't done all that God commanded us to do in worship. It's important But I'm just real leery of the attitude that a lot of people possess, that the Lord's Supper is the single most singularly important act of worship. And that's manifested, and they don't do it here at College View because we do the Lord's Supper last, but you may have worshiped someplace where they have the Lord's Supper the very first thing when the worship service begins, and you see people who take the Lord's Supper and then they get up and leave, and they don't stay for the rest of the worship. What are they reflecting when they do that? That's the one single most important thing. And it's really not. It's very important. I mean, we can't downplay the importance of it, but it's not any more important than all the other acts of worship. We'll try to talk more about that as we continue our study next week, Lord willing. Thanks, everybody.